Hello and welcome back again to another devlog. This is number 67. Kind of an interesting week this week. On Monday, I had more work to do on the enemy spawn system. I had to get the algorithm to choose an enemy spawn point that was better. It just wasn't quite what I was hoping for. And just a lot of issues to where I was able to get on Monday, I was actually able to take the next step and get the enemy prefabs working with the enemy spawn system. So I had to find per sector the actual enemy's manager that would take kind of a prefab from the enemy's registry, and based on my previous work last week, it would take the prefab and spawn it at the desired location. Okay, so on Monday I got it all set up here for the algorithm to kind of choose better. I kind of polish it up to where you're alerted, and there's an initial 10-second time before the enemy starts spawning, and then they spawn in once every 10 seconds. And now the algorithm chooses a lot better as before, and I can determine whether it's allows in the sector, out of the sector. So I did a lot of testing, and I got it to the point where it's pretty good. Um, Eventually, you get like a ton of enemies spawning. I'll try that one more time so you can see on the game view. But the algorithm is working as desired. It chooses good locations, and it doesn't have these any like outliers, and it performs to an acceptable standard. So when you get spotted, there's an initial. I also implemented functionality to have like a maximum spawn count. So it'll continue spawning, but it knows how to actually despawn enemies only if they're on screen or off screen. So that way you won't have too many enemies clogging things up, and you won't get any pop in or pop out of the enemy spawning. So it's pretty good and reliable in my opinion. So it works. It works in different situations, um, and I had to kind of go in and make sure that like situations in the room to where you want to lock the doors, it'll actually know how to. It can still spawn, but it won't spawn enemies outside the sector. It'll only allow, and it won't choose tiles outside the sector, but it will continue to spawn if the enemies are off camera within the sector. So it does support still this alert locking down of the current sector and spawning enemies inside the sector. So it's like the best of both worlds, where you can get even if you're in a far corner, um, like here, it'll know to like spawn in behind you, or if you're in a small sector, it'll know to, as long as the doors aren't locked, to spawn an enemy in the next sector, as long as they're not visible by the camera. So ironed all that out, got it working, got it spawning um, the enemies correctly, um, and I was pretty happy with that. I have this foundation, this good system to work with, and I can extend it later on to do like a player defensive enemies like spawning in off screen, things like that. Um, so my previous concern of being able to like just run past enemies and evade them on alerts is not really an issue when I was gameplay testing, because the spawn system, if you have the frequency of spawn high enough, they will continually spawn and despawn if they get too far away and they're not seen by cameras. So the actual result is that you get completely swamped by enemies and you will get hit and you will get slowed down and injured and you will die pretty reasonably quickly. You can try to invade, but it's almost like as I intended. So this whole thing about like, oh, I need to implement a stamina system once you get alerted to kind of slow the player down to get caught up, that's not really an issue. If you get alerted, like as of right now, the spawn rate, you'll be completely dead every time. There's, I've been doing gameplay testing, and there's really, yeah, there's no way out of it. So that kind of thinking, it's not until you get to actually test the gameplay where you see, oh, that's not really a problem, and it's actually working pretty good. Um, so I got that um, looking good by Tuesday and in good shape. Um, I decided to tackle another problem that I was facing. I did some work in order to, if you look at, so I did some work. I don't usually change like third-party code, but I didn't feel like going in and this is one of those cases where I'm not heavily modifying it. I just need to make a couple tweaks to it. All I wanted to do was go in and prevent the system's default behavior from actually changing anything once I have set all the connections and tested with my player that the cover line is working. The problem I was having before, I would do all these changes, test it, and then come back, and then all of a sudden, maybe on a scene reload, who knows, in vector system, be like, oh, it was like through the editor, like, oh, I'm gonna go ahead and change this setup for you. I'm gonna lose all your changes, and it became broken. So I had to go in and add a little flag to say, okay, I'm done changing, and I've tested, lock everything, and I've kind of had to go through and make sure there's no editor interaction that's actually going to modify anything after that point. So far, with those changes, it's actually held up. So I went back through, not through this the whole level, but just this room to kind of to see if this actually works and the changes that I made and tested will actually hold up and stay unchanged. That's what I'm looking for. So we'll just keep an eye on that. So that's kind of my plan for moving forward. I have a whole list of things. Instead of the plan is kind of have a process to work my way up from from room to room. Instead of like I did with the cover, instead of going through the whole level and doing a whole implementation of cover, I have several things that I'm gonna start, working room to room. We'll talk about later, but pretty much like a checklist, like to get it to 100% production level quality. Like, like a room should have lighting and mesh optimization. If it has cover, it should have proper cover implemented. If it needs enemies and enemy patrols, that's, like all of these things before I move on to the next room. So I go room by room and do a checklist to make sure each room has all the necessary, instead of going through and just like, okay, now I'm going to add enemies to the whole level, one at a time. I'm going to do everything room by room and then progress through the end of the level that way. That's kind of the plan from here. So this new fixes of the cover. I've gone up to a certain point, and as I work my way through the level, I'll do additional fixes as I can from here on out. So that's the kind of the process I'll work with going on forward. When I was working with cover, I spotted a case. What was happening? I previously last week I was running to these. I was testing cover and working with cover last week, and I was running to these freezing issues, and I was like, wow, what's happening? Is Unity bugging out on me? I'm gonna take the time to upgrade it from 6.0 to 6.2 and see if that works. And I didn't see any problem. I was like, okay, I must have solved it. Must have been a weird Unity thing. Well, I actually was having freezing issues again. I was like, what the heck? You know, I had to restart the editor. I was like, what the heck's going on here? So it turns out what I learned is that, you know, I consider myself a good enough programmer to, you know, to not get to not implement something that could potentially be an infinite loop, right? Well, it turned out when I was doing cover a long time ago, I had this functionality to kind of select a point, you know, to transition to. And the cover I was testing, you know, I could do a while loop and say, while this chain of links does not equal null, you know, select the furthest cover point, right? Well, with new cover setups, it actually allowed the while loop to loop endlessly. So in some situations, it's like it finds a cover point and then it's guaranteed to terminate. You know, that doesn't. But in these new loops, it just goes round and round, and that actually causes the editor to freeze. And I've never experienced a true. I think I've had before, but I kind of knew what was going on. But what happens in an infinite loop, it actually freezes the editor like it's some sort of system issue with Unity. You're like, and you can't really tell that it's actually your code that's causing the infinite loop. You just think the editor is frozen or that you need to update Unity or something. But it was actually an infinite loop, and you can't really tell if you run Profiler. It'll freeze as well, so you can't. The profiler is not going to continue and say, "Oh, here's your script and it's taking up all CPU." No, the whole thing shuts down. The only way to I actually found it improved, it was an infinite loop, is by going into um, my code editor and setting breakpoints, and the application's still running, and I had to kind of narrow down and kind of retest like the specific area of what, you know, I finally kind of reproduced like, you know, when it was crashing, like, oh, okay, or when it was freezing. It's, you know, it's something to do with cover, and it's not until I got to this one point where it consistently froze right here, and that's where the infinite loop was. So I was able to identify that in my code and fix it up. But it's just interesting because I didn't recognize that it was an infinite loop, and I didn't think, you know, it was possible for a bug like that to sneak in. So it's like always when you're doing a while loop, you have to have some sort of safety. You can't just have like a potentially, even if whatever you tested in doesn't show that it could, that means like the requirements could change. You could use it in a different way, and then the algorithm will break. Like if you have a different cover line that is circular, you could, you know, you could have an infinite loop on your hands. So now if the application freezes, now I can kind of learn and say, okay, it might be an infinite loop somewhere, even though it's very, very rare. Um, so at the end of Wednesday, I was going back to my Kanban board, doing some project management work, and reviewing my tickets. I set up a bunch of new, like a new tranche of tickets to tackle. The first one on the list is kind of an issue um, that I was seeing when I was doing gameplay testing uh, for for enemy alerting and enemy spawning. So if I can demonstrate it here, what was happening is that, let's just say, and I've kind of run into this problem before a long time ago, and I was like early testing, and I was kind of considering before, like, how do I handle this situation, even before I'd done enemies and anything like this. Now I was getting to this point of gameplay testing where it's actually becoming an issue. The situation is, if we enable enemies, um, let's just say you're running down the hallway here, and you're running, and then all of a sudden, boom, there's an enemy here. He was just off screen, but you know, you didn't have time to respond to him or see him or anything like that. you just run into them, and that doesn't really feel fair. Like some other games, they implement like a little radar system that kind of gives you a heads up, or anything else, right? Um, my previous idea was to, in certain hallways, like actually, um, if you're traveling down a hallway, um, I want the camera to kind of not center the player, but kind of lead so the the player is on the left side of the screen, depending on where they're traveling. And if they switch, the camera will shift to this side, so the player will be over here, and give it like a wide berth, and you can kind of see ahead of you more than if you're just centered on the screen, right? I tried a new solution to, because I'd done this work previously with hallways, and one of the drawbacks is if you do this solution with hallways, you kind of have to go through each of these hallways and apply the right, the right settings per V camera to get it to work. And I tried something else where I had a different system where instead of following the player with a V camera, I added a little game object that would kind of, depending on the joystick input, it would shift the target to look out forward or backwards, depending on the input, and then that object is what the camera would track. But I got it working for X and Y, and then also in Z if you're moving in a up-down hallway. But there was something weird going on, like it would track ahead, but the actual processing of the character was very jittery and framey, and it didn't look good at all, right? There's some sort of like late update processing. It was just, it worked, but it wasn't very good. So I kind of scrapped that solution and went back to my original solution that I had before, which was working with the actual virtual camera controller, and the implementation had been previously broken, but I went and fixed it up, and instead of using a game object to track, I went and did a lerp, depending on the joystick input, off of the camera follow, X offset and Z offset, and that actually did the trick. I was actually able to get it working much better, and no odd, you know, player jitter when you're moving, and so that worked as before. The system was repaired, but at the end of the day, I have this, but it still really didn't solve the problem, even if, okay, so this is working, you can see, but the problem is still, like, even though the camera leads you, it still doesn't give you enough time to actually see the enemy coming. Like, let's try over here. Even if you are, so it's just still not enough to actually get, to actually stop yourself from running straight into them, even if the camera is actually leading the target a bit, depending on where you're running. So I had to come up with a different solution, and instead of an on-screen UI, I decided to go with like a visual nose cone, as you can see here. And I didn't want it on all the time, but its main purpose is to actually, like I said, when you're traveling towards the enemy, it's like a visual indicator that there's an actual enemy off screen looking in your direction, and If you see that, that means it gives you kind of a heads up, so it feels more fair instead of just running headlong into an enemy. And I had to kind of go in and I used the security camera VFX. I repurposed it once again, and I kind of thinned it down to get a much nicer view cone for the enemy. And but like I said, I don't want this to be on all the time when it looks ridiculous. I mean, not it's kind of not ridiculous, but it kind of like when you're in a room full of enemies, you got light cones everywhere. It's not really. I just want it as an indicator so you can actually be aware of enemies off screen. So I had to go in and I had to make sure that when this is when an enemy is off screen, it will turn itself on. But as soon as you kind of the enemy comes on screen, it will slowly fade out to nothing, right? And then you'll have just a regular enemy. And so that's pretty good now. That kind of it could use a little polish maybe here and there, but it gets the job done to where um, you know it stops the problem from happening where you just run right into the enemy. Um, so that was Wednesday, Thursday. Got it all working. But one of the other issues still when you're running into an enemy um, was the problem of, let's just say, you're running into an enemy and you're not really spotted by the enemy, but you're kind of close enough to where, so you can see it here. You're running and then oh, I see him. I'm not within range, but I'm going to turn around and run the other direction. Well, your footsteps will still alert him, even though he doesn't spot you, and that's kind of a problem. I kind of what I had to do is I had to make some considerations based off so like footstep detection. Like I had to kind of refine it a little bit to where we can see. What I did was um, it still kind of works. Um, it works much better in fact. But another problem is that let's just say I'm running down the hallway and I don't really have this thing going on, this lead thing going on. Let's put it to none. And I'm running, and then I run into the enemy. He's not in front of me, but he's right there, and that would have the same effect. Even though he's not seeing you, he'll hear your footsteps, and you'll get caught, and it has the same effect of running into him when he's looking at you. So I had to go in and I had to make exceptions to where it says, okay, if you are running and you run into an enemy, he won't detect you if you're behind him. In this yellow area, you can make footsteps and he won't detect you if he's on patrol. But if you get into this purple area and do footsteps, you're too close and you're still running, he will detect you. But also, so I had to use dot product comparison in the radius, but it works the opposite way. If you're in front of him and within his view cone in this range and you do footsteps, that will alert him. So there's an exception on this angle, but when you're running up behind him and you don't see him, there's a bit of a grace area, except when you're too close in this combat range. So I think that's all working pretty good. I'll have to do some more testing as I go, but last time I left it, it was looking pretty solid. So that was looking good. I kind of decided to shift gears to another problem to tackle. So I'll set that up now here. Okay, so the next problem I was tackling was I'd worked with entities before, but I have these areas in the game where they're outside the player's view. I call them the background areas. Like you can't get to them. They're there for like visual purposes to kind of give depth to the area. But you can't go in here. You can't collide with anything. So that's a perfect candidate for like entities optimization, right? And I was trying to remember how I did that before, and basically the solution is actually um, is making a subscene, right? And this is a little vehicle, little functionality unit provides to actually a scene within a scene, and anything within that scene, all the objects are actually converted to like entity objects. Um, that's interesting. I don't actually know where. Oh, maybe if you turn it on. Made a static mesh. So there's like two steps. I took all these objects and I combined them into a single mesh. Kept the originals, but they don't have any mesh renderers. But they do provide the original particle systems and all that. Um, One thing that's interesting to me right now, I have these inactive objects. Yes, they don't have mesh renderers, but they do have other things. They have particle systems, which is needed for this. But they contain all contain all these colliders and stuff. And I wonder if I should like remove these colliders if that would actually be more efficient. But everything else, it's pretty much benign. But they do have these colliders, and it kind of defeats the purpose of having entities. But I'll kind of revisit that later. That's something to consider. But it's supposed to be like a lean entities object. The first step is to combine the mesh, and the second step is to turn them into entities. So they're like super lean rendering, and they're not meant to be interacted with. So I figured that out, and that's kind of the process I'll be using for other areas in the game where I call them like their background areas, where I can just have entities renderer instead of full-fledged game objects with everything like that. So okay, so I figured out how to do that. And one of the other things I was doing, I was wanting to fix a functionality. I had a script in my demo, one of my demo third-party projects that allowed you to, and I did this before, where you could actually deploy a script on a monoscript on an object, like a wall or something, and it would actually be able to spawn in some sort of decal prefab, depending on. But the problem with this is that I would have to go through every prefab in my level and add this monoscript to each and every object in order to get it to work. I had to come up with a better solution in order to, depending on where the projectile hits, to actually spawn the decal at that point. So I kind of took that script and I kind of reworked it into my own script and put it on the actual weapon. For each weapon, you can define different decals and stuff. And every projectile that comes from the weapon kind of gets a reference from that. And if he gets a hit on any of these layers, applicable layers, so you can kind of filter by layer, it'll actually spawn a prefab. So essentially making it like, instead of adding monoscripts to everything, you're adding monoscripts to the gun and then detecting a hit and then spawning the decal there. So that was what I was looking for. So now it's like pretty much anything that's allowed. I guess doors aren't allowed yet, but anything that hits, it'll get a nice little shot decal. So I applied that to the player weapons, and it also works for the enemy weapons as well, which is good. That was a good thing to do. Another issue I was facing it was there was an issue. I couldn't quite reproduce it where if you got hit by an enemy weapon, your shield VFX would go on, and that's fine. And after a certain amount of hits, your shield VFX would break and do a recharge, and that all worked perfectly fine. The cycle was valid and all that, but I finally figured out and reproduced that if you get hit and your shield breaks and then you do a stealth, I did certain like exceptions for stealth, like when your shield is recharging. Well, if your shield recharges, it does like an effect, but um, once you take it off and you start jumping around, there is like a Y zone. If the character moves past that, you'll see like the dissolve VFX, like when you're jumping. And I wanted to fix that, so I had to kind of go in and retest and rework that. But now, um, if you get hit, it actually all works now. So it was a slight issue, slight bug that I finally pinned down and fixed up, and that's actually working now. Um, so I got all that. Just keep working through my issues on my chart, and the next real thing that I finally came to was finalizing my light solution. Now, I had previously attempted, um, it's been a whole process of working with, lighting, how to get it right. I've always had the issue of, we can take a look at a room, just a normal room. I got normal lights, real-time lights, and I've always had this optimization battle, like especially when I was working, like thinking about doing a VR, like how do I? It works and it runs at okay FPS. It's not terrible, but I knew I was trying to figure out how to do the absolute full optimization that you can with Unity system. And while the game works, and even in production the game works, it's still not optimized the way I like to. So the big problem problem A that I solved was the batches. If you go ahead and you go ahead and bake all these meshes and stuff into one single mesh, you can really get these batches down. But it helps. It probably saves you about 20% on efficiency. That's great. But the real problem and the real optimization drain is what this is: the shadow casters, the lighting shadow casters, real-time lighting shadows. And for the life of me, that has been the hardest thing for me to actually figure out how to do and solve. I've made several attempts, and I've seriously almost, just considered going with real-time lighting and just manually curating and saying, okay, this one will have a light, that one will have a light, this one will have a light. And, you know, just really limiting my shadows and doing like a lot of manual selection of which objects can cast shadows and which can't. Um, because I just couldn't figure out how to get the system to work. I've tried this and that, and I've tried different frameworks and packages like Bakery, and I just can't find the actual solution to the problem. But it's one of the things that I know that it's something that I have to get right. I know it's possible, but I'm just unable to, for whatever reason, figure out how to get it done. So that's what I tackled on Friday. It was kind of an interesting week because I got an alert on my phone saying that my area was experiencing a lot of flooding and water, and says, I was like, I kind of brushed it off and be like, oh, it'll be okay. But then I got another message in the evening that says, evacuate the area. So I had to kind of pack up my things, pack up my computer, and go to my mom and dad's house and do my work from there. And it was kind of a tough job. Um, the workspace was super noisy, almost impossible. But I kept putting in my hours for the session. The actual chair that I was using was super uncomfortable. Riding that thing for 8 hours, I got a new chair, but it was a little better, but it still sucked. Um, and just a lot of other problems. But I filled out my time for this week. But the whole thing on Friday, and I'll kind of show you. All right, so here it is in all its glory. Um, I I was ready to put in a whole week if necessary to get this right. Um, this is a lot. I have to finalize my lighting solution, and I always knew it was possible. I just couldn't figure out how to do it. So working at mom and dad's house and testing every combination of under the sun with lighting. Um, you go to here, the lighting, the main lighting window, and I was trying combinations of baking lighting with bakery and I eventually just threw up my hands. I just could not get it to work. There was something I totally I tried bakery again, but it was actually on play. It was actually doing something weird, like it was setting everything super bright like before. So I totally ditched that third party framework and I went back to just like doing something very basic, very simple, and I had some sort of working scene where I had kind of baked like working, but I could never figure out how to do shadow masking. And what shadow masking is like if you take a look at these little areas. Here's a good area down here. What shadow masking is, if you can just look at the comparison of her head, the orange head and the tail. It's bright, right? And if you're in the shadow, and you take a look, it's all dimly lit, right? That's shadow masking, and shadow masking is important. My goal was to get baked lighting, right? Um, Baked indirect and baked direct lighting, right? Um, so if I could actually, I can't really demonstrate, but essentially this is a scene working with baked lighting. You can't really notice. This right here is a baked light. Like it looks pretty much the same. So at the end of the day, I bumped up the resolution of the actual baked lighting, and it used to be all crappy and artifacty, but if you bump up the resolution and you get it done right, you get a nice defined baked lighting shadow. It looks just as good as like a soft dynamic shadow. You can't tell the difference. But the big problem that I was never able to overcome was, when you have baked lighting and real-time lighting shadows, how do you blend the two? It was always theory and text and AI, but getting it to work was another thing. Like if you're in the shadow, you should be occluded by the shadow. With normal baked lighting and no shadow masking, it would be clear. You could be standing in a big shadow and not get any sort of that shadow wouldn't take effect on the dynamic character because it was baked. Well, the solution is light probes, right? I messed around with light probes, but I can never really figure out how to set it up correctly or get it working right. And I finally got something working, and the aha moment I think was really throwing me off. I was working with this whole scene, and I was working on a very high foundation. I had to go back to a very basic scene and get a very basic, uh, um, a very basic prototype working with shadow masking. Once I had that in my pocket, I could build up from that. I could add fancy things. So I just got a basic light probe working in my demo scene with a dynamic object and a static object, and I was able to finally figure out how to get it working, and that was the ticket. And I I was able to build the system now that I'll use for the rest of the game, and that is, as you can see in the stats here, this is finally what I was going for. Knew it was possible. It was, so you look at the shadow casters, right? These are only 43 shadows for dynamic objects that are not static. That's the ball, and there's a few more on the character because there's a lot of skin mesh renders, but everything else in the scene is static. All these other shadows are baked, and you can see that with a combination of mesh baking and a low shadow caster count, you get a very, very low batches count. That is what I'm looking for. So originally this scene had a batches above 2,000 and a shadow caster about 1,200 shadows for everything using real-time lighting. And so I had to work step by step, but from a very basic example. Okay, that works. Now let's add a little bit more. Okay, that works. And I eventually got a blueprint, an outline for a solution that I can apply to my project now, using pretty much all my optimization techniques. I even have reflection probes in this scene. And the main concept here is that I can have the system to actually call on the main lights of the room, the sector, and have those um, lights work as mixed, where they will illuminate real-time objects, dynamic objects like a character, but also work to bake in lights for static objects. Right? There's a limitation about combining them, but if I do it right, like in this scene, I can actually achieve what I was looking for here. The actual baked lighting that interacts with dynamic real-world objects through shadow masking. I was even able to figure out how to set up adaptive probe volumes. Before, I could not figure out how to do it, and I guess the bakery package was throwing me off or something, but step by step, I was actually able to. At first, I had just had light probes, using magic light probes, and I was running into the issue where if you're going along cover, it would have this, it wouldn't work quite right. You get this, this darkness, and as you were going along, it wouldn't be seamless and consistent. It would actually brighten up and then dim, brighten up and then dim as you were moving through. That wasn't good. But with adaptive probe volumes, not only do you not have to set up anything manually, but it also is consistent enough to where you don't get this light dip in and dip out. I think the magic light probes package I had, it was before the adaptive probe volume came out, and it was a way to actually automate setting up your light probes so you don't have to do it manually. But this allows for proper shadow masking, and this is the solution I was looking for. So this was like a really big win. This was a big piece in order, if I don't have proper optimization, or I just can't figure out, I'm just going to have a subpar game. But if I have this system of proper optimization for my game, I can actually build and release a production level product. And this was like a key piece that I needed to figure out, and it took a very long time, and I was running into so many issues. It was probably the hardest thing to figure out. But if you look at the FPS for this scene now, it's like at 100. It's like where consistently in a scene like this would probably run at 60 or something. You could get by with it, but it's not right. So this is really a big milestone, actually being able to figure this out. And I was definitely willing to just however long it takes. So I literally tried everything, and I was struggling until I finally had that breakthrough of just going back to just a very simple project, bare bones, and just getting a very simple concept working, and then step by step applying it to this whole system where full optimization. I have things all baked and everything's looking good, and it's all optimized, but it looks good, if not better than just a normal scene with real-time lights. So That was a huge win, and a good win for the week was that also my house just barely got missed by the flood. The actual weather changed at the last second, and a few more days of rain or another foot or two, and my house would have been underwater with the rest. A lot of people in my neighborhood got their houses flooded, but my house was miraculously missed on this one. So it was a close call. It was a dodged bullet, but I was able to get back into my house and continue on. And So thank God for that. And that is pretty much all there is for the week. Um, it's a good to start for next week. So now I have a proper system to start from the very first room and actually apply this model here to each room, to each sector of the level. So we'll continue and look for more next week. Thanks for joining us this time, and we will check in with you next time. Goodbye.